But first, with U.S. President Donald Trump's tariff deadline looming, Canadian industries are bracing themselves as Ottawa's negotiations with the U.S. continue.
It has to be a deal that works for Canadians and Canadian workers. And part of the reason why we don't have a deal is that deal is not yet on the table.
Prime Minister Mark Carney speaking this past week in Hamilton, where he announced new tariffs on steel products from countries without a free trade agreement with Canada. The Carney government had a change of tone for the first time this past week, acknowledging publicly that any deal with the U.S. would likely involve some level of tariffs. The tariffs will be top of mind when Carney meets with premiers in Muskoka, Ontario on Tuesday. For a closer look at this and other political developments this past week, Lori Turnbull is here. She's a political science professor at Dalhousie University, and we've reached her this morning in Ottawa. Nice to see you, Lori.
Nice to see you too. Thanks for having me.
Okay, a lot to get through looking back to the past week, but let's look ahead first to Tuesday's meeting between Carney and the premiers. What are you expecting his message will be, and what are you hoping to see come out of this meeting?
So this is going to be a meeting for a few days between the premiers, and Carney, I think, is going to join them on day 2. And so there's going to be a conversation going on already about the effects of the tariff war with the U.S., the situation with trying to get a deal, and we're not there yet. And I think Carney is going to try to talk to the premiers about what the plan is going to be between now and August 1st. Because we're not sure, Carney is saying there's no deal because there's no deal. Essentially, is how I read his comment. He's saying that there are going to be we shouldn't be expecting a deal without tariffs. That's probably going to be part of the package. But the provinces are now at the point where they've been there for a while, where they're thinking, how is this going to affect our industries? What is our plan now? And what might be helpful for one industry is not necessarily helpful for another. And so the premiers are coming at this conversation saying, look, we need to make sure that our industries, our particular interests are being accommodated here. And so I think it will be a crunchy conversation between the premiers, and Carney, I think, will be trying to get a sense of what their headspace is in terms of ideas for national projects, and also how to manage a situation with Trump where it seems like we're getting to this August 1 deadline and tariffs are still here.
And so is the uncertainty. And we know the federal government has said they are negotiating, not in the public, but privately. So much to your point about what's happening, we just don't know. But as you also mentioned, a trade deal without some sort of tariffs, based on what Carney said last week, is more the likely situation. So for Canadians listening to his message, what do you think that's signaling to them?
Okay, so, Carney was elected largely, I think, because he represented something very different in terms of how to deal with Trump. He, as we know, the Liberals were looking like they were facing an absolute mess in the next election, but Trudeau leaves, Carney comes in, and it's all on this, he has this very unique skill set and set of experiences that would make him better equipped to deal with Trump. So from a political perspective, there's everything riding on this for Carney. He needs to show that he can get through somehow. On the other hand, when Trump does these things like send letters to 20 national leaders around the world saying, we are going to raise tariffs and we're going to do blanket tariffs with 35%, in some countries it's even worse, unless you do these certain things, we can see Trump having these temper tantrums. And I think people will look at that and say, look, like there's probably there's nothing Carney can do to change who Trump is and to change the fact that this is the way Trump negotiates. What Carney's left with is, what do you do, to protect our interests in light of the fact that you're dealing with someone who isn't rational and who doesn't have any interest in being rational, I don't think. And so I think that's where the idea comes. It all comes back to things like the nation building projects, getting the premiers to cooperate on things, which I think Doug Ford is taking a big lead on here so that Carney doesn't have to do all that work. And the other premiers are too, obviously. But for Carney, it's also about being able to show things like diversifying trade, joining Rearm Europe, and getting somewhere so that our reliance on Trump is less. So I think that's what he's trying to do now, especially leading up to that August 1 deadline. They're trying to manage expectations so that people don't expect some miracle by August 1, but they can still see that their progress has been made.
I want to talk to you about Bill C-5, that federal bill to fast-track these infrastructure projects across the country. Mark Carney holding his first meeting to talk about this. He's been consulting with First Nations leaders as well. But we also, in Ontario, for instance, saw the 9 First Nations communities who have filed this injunction. They want to see this stopped. Bill C-5, the federal bill, as well as the provincial bill in Ontario, Bill 5. How much of a roadblock do you think this is going to be for Carney and his government to get these projects up and running, given the reaction and the pushback from these Indigenous communities?
Absolutely. And so I think this is going to be a very significant and a constant challenge, in the sense that Indigenous consultation, having those conversations and them being meaningful conversations is part of the way Canada works. Like that's the reality. That's the legal reality. That's the constitutional reality. And Prime Minister Carney knows that. I think what we can see is he wants to get these projects through. Like, period. That this is what he has staked his political, enterprise on. These projects need to go through. They can't all be held up for a number of years, or else his promise about these fast deadlines and getting the approvals through, it's not going to work. And so I think what we can see is he's opening up conversations. He had the meeting this past week. The leaders from the AFN, from the Native Women's Association, and from Métis Council, they're all going to be present at the Premier's meeting, I think, tomorrow. And so there's a sense of inclusion, and they're having these conversations. But I think what it's going to come down to is, what does consultation really mean? So not too long ago, the Justice Minister, Sean Fraser, said consultation doesn't necessarily mean veto. And then not too long later, he walked that back. But I think that that's what the government thinks. Like, I don't necessarily think that they anticipate that every consultation is going to end with consensus and that everybody's going to agree. In fact, there isn't agreement across the board, among First Nations, in the Indigenous population. Of course not. There's lots of different groups, lots of different leaders, different perspectives. And so I think the practicality of it is going to come down to the government finding partners in the Indigenous community on each project, not blanket agreement among everybody, but they're going to find people who they can work with. And then they're going to, I suspect, try to load that up prior to the announcement of the project. They're going to be doing this work on an ongoing basis. And so it's kind of what happens behind the scenes politically, what can happen in terms of meaningful conversation that will push a project forward, but not expecting that everybody's going to gather around and hold hands and be happy, because unfortunately, I don't think that's what's going to happen.
And we'll have to leave it there. Laurie Turnbull, thank you so much for your time and for your insight, as always.